Welcome, everybody. I'm dialing in here from you can see me. Okay, I love this Zoom technology. It goes wherever we Zoom.
There's a lot of feedback, Beck. A lot of feedback.
All right, so let me see who I can mute.
That's good.
And that might be helpful.
Okay, it's good now.
Better? Okay. All right, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody is well and had a good week. Glad to be back with you again today. Thank you, Glenn. As we know, Glenn Grossman, our host, is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. While pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, Glenn served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years and taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and at UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology projects with Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, the Military Health Service, CDC, and other programs in the US and outside of the US. He currently is Senior Director of Outcomes Research and Epidemiology at Novartis, but all views expressed today are his own. So before we get into things, I think it's important to share that Glenn had a birthday this week. So if I'm going to invite you to unmute, I will unmute you, and if you would rather mute yourself, you can just mute. And I think we should kick it off today with singing happy birthday to our host. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Glenn. Happy birthday to you.
It's a, oh.
I need to clarify. I no longer have birthdays. I just have anniversaries of my 21st birthday. I've just been celebrating that anniversary for many years now.
All right, Glenn. So hold on. I will remute everybody and I'll unmute you. Okay, mute all. Okay. Oh, Glenn, you're still muted.
I'm mute.
Okay, good. There you are. All right. So, Glenn, it's been a busy news week, huh? Feels like things have been changing rather rapidly this week, and not in a good way. So, maybe like usual, you can kind of take us through what's happening in our neck of the woods and in the wider U.S. and how it compares to what you're seeing around the world.
Yeah, sure. So let's go ahead and get started. So yeah, over the last week in the United States, there were over 335,000 cases just in the last week alone. This is not including July 4th, so this is going back, well, it does include July 4th, but I assume that some of these are undercounts because just because a lot of people didn't get tested yesterday or today. But so, and so some states weren't even reporting, I think. And so we're gonna see a big bump up early next week to compensate for what we're seeing now. And so, yeah, so this is worrisome. Let me dig into some of the states. One thing to point out, so again, these are the diagnosed positive cases at the state level. When you look at the estimated total number of new infections per day, that's approximately 215,000. So we're not doing a great job of capturing it. It's largely because of this test positive rate. We're not doing enough tests in much of the country. So let me come down here. So you can see the Northeast is doing pretty well. And so when you have numbers this low of the test positive rate, the only way to get there is it means that we're doing tons of screenings. And so with all the contact tracing, we're going out and screening everyone and making sure that we can identify people. So in the Northeast, we've been through most of the rough times over the last few months, but now we have our act together. The Midwest is starting to climb back up again, unfortunately. And this is reflected both in the numbers of positives, but also their test positive rate is starting to go up, which means that they're not testing enough, which means that it's going to get out of control again. In the South, they are really not testing enough down there. Both the number of positives are increasing and the test positive rate is going up, which means that they're starting to limit the testing to only symptomatic people, just because they're starting to run out of tests, and there's just because of lack of availability. Some people, if they're going to try to get tests, might have to wait for an hour or more to get the test, and so in some places, and so as a result, only symptomatic people are being prioritized, or in the hospitals they're being prioritized. So the percent positive is starting to climb up, and it means it's out of control because there's all of these other people out there who are being infected, who they have no idea who they are. We have no idea who they are, and there's so going back again just to share. So these 50,000 people, order of magnitude, that are diagnosed, we're assuming that there are currently roughly 150,000, a little over 150,000 who are currently infected and are not diagnosed each day. So this accumulates over the last week. It's the accumulation of this. This is the daily count. So we don't have it under control. When you look at the variation by region, you can see the South, every week we've been talking, the South has been getting worse and worse. The West, their uptake curve is not quite as aggressive as in the South, but we see that the South is very rapidly coming to a bad place. When you look at where the hotspots are on a state level, Florida has gotten over 10,000 new cases per day, and so this is not good. Texas is approaching that. They're a little over 8,000, so they'll be over 10,000 probably this coming week. California is jumping back up again. Arizona's numbers are fluctuating, but again, I think that they're just not reporting sufficiently, and that's why the numbers seem lower here, but they're very quickly going to be over 5,000 as well. And then we see that there's a bunch of other states that are in trouble as well. Louisiana, they're just not reporting. I don't know why it says 0 here. I don't know what's going on, but Louisiana is a tricky place as well. Here's a better graphic that I'm looking at. So this is New York. New York got hit the hardest early on. You see the shape of our uptake curve in terms of the diagnosed cases. And again, what I just said, diagnosed cases versus actually infected is a very different number. This early uptake curve was just random across the whole population because no one knew who was infected. Whereas now a lot of the people being infected are the younger people. So that's why the death rates and the hospitalization rates haven't gone up quite as fast as they did originally with New York. But you can see that the hot spots right now in terms of the growth rates, you see Arizona, even though their total number was not as much as on this page, you can see that as a proportion of the population, this is absolute numbers, but there's just a lot more people living in Florida here than there are in Arizona. And so as a result, when you look at the adjusted numbers based on the population size, Arizona has a much larger portion of people who are getting infected. Florida is catching up. And then behind that are South Carolina, Louisiana, Nevada, Georgia, Texas, and some others that get your birth. But you see that there's a lot of movement. Whereas in the beginning here, it was New York, New Jersey was in green. I think Connecticut was early. There were just some, and then there was a slower uptake among some of these other states. You see now that there's a much bigger early uptake, and that's what's reflected across the South, the West, and not as much to the Midwest or Northeast, but the Midwest is not, they need to work on what they're doing as well. I saw this one. This one's a little bit interesting. So this that shows the increase in daily tests relative to the increase in daily cases. So the daily cases are standing out here. The hospitalization rates have not jumped up to the same degree that they did early on back in March and April. And so that's interesting. But again, it's because the cohort of people, the group of people that's now getting infected, like I say, are lower risk people, and across almost any way you can look at it. Typically the ones who had lots of other diseases, co-diseases, and higher risk because of age and other things were staying home. But the problem is that now all of these infected people are bringing the disease back to their households and back home and back to their circles of friends. So this hospitalization rate is going to continue to rise. I predict over the next couple of weeks, it's going to rise at a higher rate than what we're seeing now. And then the death rate, another 2, 3, 4 weeks from now, we're going to start seeing the death rate meaningfully go change direction. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Here's the hospitalization. You see, relative to where we were, that the South and the West are currently having a little bit more hospitalization, but they're nowhere near where we were back in March. All right. Oh, I guess let me talk about some. Here, wait, let me stop this for a second. Stop share. All right.
Glenn, while you're looking for the next page here, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, you can send them in to me and I'll organize everybody. And the second half of our session, we'll do kind of a live Q&A. Right now, Glenn's taking us through questions that he received during the week, and then we'll move into the sort of live Q&A bit.
So first I'll go back to the U.S. and then I can go to let's see, I can go to look abroad. But first, so there are a few extra states here that we see that are not doing so well right now. I think I saw, this was what I just showed. This is interesting. It breaks it down on a county by county level. And you see that when you look at a county by county level rather than a state level, you can see that there's a lot of counties that are really not doing well. So even if a state as a whole has a lot of green in it, if they also have red, then the greens can very quickly, the spread can go and jump counties, particularly when we're looking at hospital beds and stuff. And so some of these red areas where there's just a lot, you can see the top 4 right now are Arizona, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, that have just a lot of new cases that have been diagnosed within their state as a proportion of the population. They're getting close to some of their hospital capacity. Some of them still have a fair amount of room. Let me go to, yeah, so in some, you see in Arizona here, there are some counties that are doing okay, but it's really becoming critical for the ICU beds that are available. And so Arizona is in trouble right now. Texas, because it's so large, they still, when you look at it as a whole state, there's still a lot of beds that are available. But then the problem is when you start digging into specific counties, then you start realizing that there's maybe less beds available. There's not available data in this one, but you can see quite a lot of red when you dig into specific counties. So it's really a county by county outbreak that we have to start looking at this thing. All right, testing and tracing is still not sufficient. I mean, they've given up in most of the South and the West. The Northeast, we have it under control. That's great. New York's cases have been rising a little bit, but New Jersey has stayed pretty good. We're still relatively the same. The Northeast as a whole is doing pretty okay now. When we're looking abroad, again, I'm just going to jump right to the South America, because that's really where I'm putting a lot of my attention right now, because it's winter time in South America. And so their experience now is probably going to be what our experience is going to be like come November, December. And so Argentina, for instance, is just going up. Brazil, which we've been following for a while, is continuing to go up. They're not doing enough testing there. But so we're a little over 50,000 new cases per day. Brazil is approaching 40,000 new cases a day, but they're just not doing enough testing. So I don't know how to interpret that very much. But I mean, I can interpret it that they're in bad shape. It's getting worse. And herd immunity, we don't know what level herd immunity is going to how many people need to be infected in order for us to sort of see this sort of beginning of the outbreak burning out in different places and what we call herd immunity. But I believe that much of South America will hit that within the next couple of months before the end of our summer. And then we'll have a really good idea of what that level needs to be for the burnout. And so it's unfortunate, but I think that we'll see it from them. So when we look at Chile, I don't know what's going on with these. I think that their testing is insufficient right now. And Peru, I was just looking at that. Peru too. Their testing was doing well. I don't know if this is actually a real effect that we're looking at with the number of new cases going down, but that's something we're gonna have to be paying attention to. Also, I mean, Sweden, people have been looking at about that, talking about that from the very beginning. You can see that it had an uptake curve, then they managed to freeze it for a little while, and now it's gone up again, and it's just moving all over the place at a higher level. There are a lot of hospitalizations and deaths at a much higher rate in Sweden versus similar other countries in Europe. And then US, here we are. So our number of cases is going up dramatically. This number is wrong, the 47,000. I think that it wasn't refreshed in a little while. But the CDC reported that it's over the last few days, it's been over 50,000 a day, what I just showed you a little earlier. Yeah, so Chile, here's Chile, Peru, United States, Brazil's uptake curve is going to pass us at some point. Although United States, we were doing not so poorly, but then over the last few weeks, we've started to get on this exponential curve again. So, so I don't know what that's going to look like over the next month or two. Bangladesh, I'll get to that in a second. Bangladesh and India, I'll get to that a little bit later in some of the questions that we had. But for now, let me just close it there, Beck. I'll just bring it back to you.
Okay, excellent, Glenn, thank you. So with these pretty astounding charts that are really showing real, intense data, do you think the chances of the South and West locking down have increased with the 4th of July weekend?
That is a really good question. So the first thing I'm looking at, I said this earlier, that there's just not the political will to lock down in some of these places. And so I was looking at the political will. And I think that's starting to change. Where did I put it? Here it is. So there's a poll tracking, it's Morning Consult, has been asking this question for weeks now. Is social distancing worth the cost? And you saw among Democrats, it stayed pretty even, above 85% or so. And in Republicans in the country, it was going down to around 50%. But in the last couple of weeks, it's gone back up. So this is as of June 29th. So Monday of this past week. Now 62% of the Republicans believe that social distancing is worth the cost. Originally, back in March during the shutdowns, it was closer to 80%. So I think that when this number goes back up, then there's going to be more, that will coincide, I think, with the leaders of a lot of these conservative states, their willingness to shut down. And so this is a good sign that the numbers are going back up. I'm hoping that, because the alternative is if hospitalizations get out of control and the death rate starts to go up, then people will be shaken and scared into sort of locking down, but it already will be too late at that point. So my goal is that there's enough motivation by people who live in these states to shut down, that there will be the political will to shut down before it's too late. Like, so right now they should be shutting down right now. Like complete lockdown in many of these states that we're talking about, they should be locked down right now. But because they're not, it's just a matter of time. And the longer they wait, the more pain there's gonna be. Because right now it's great, the death rate is low, the hospitalization rate isn't so bad, but the uptake curve that they're on is not good. And so they should be locking down right now to stop it. But I don't know, right now this is an early sign that this is good, that hopefully it's jumping up, and so there will be political will to lock down, but we'll see.
So Glenn, can you talk about the controversy surrounding people actually dying of COVID-19 versus dying with the disease versus from the disease? Do we have a better sense about how many more people have actually died from COVID-19 versus what is reported?
Yeah, so there's been some really good work on this. It's hard to do in real time because basically what you do is in fact, I think I have an earlier one. I should have pulled this out. In fact, yeah, let me just spend a couple minutes on this. If I can find it really quickly. So in terms of all-cause mortality, I don't know that I'm gonna be able to find it. Let me just use these. So basically, basically, when you're talking about all-cause mortality, is this it? No. This was an early one. I'll just talk to it. I don't have a good slide that I have right here. So when we're talking about all-cause mortality, let me just jump back. So we have a really good idea of how many people die every year from what causes. So if you were to say, how many heart attacks would you expect in the United States in the year 2020? We know very precisely what that number is. I mean, not to the exact person, but like plus or minus 1%, we have a really, really good idea of the total numbers. We don't know what specific people are gonna die. I mean, there's risk factors and there's things you don't know what specific people are gonna die, but at a population level, you know how many 65-year-olds, how many 75-year-olds, you know what all the distributions are. And so when you track it on an annual basis or a monthly basis, you have a really good sense of the population level, how many people you would expect to die. Like this is just a core concept in epidemiology that there's, you understand what this variation is. Next week, I'll show you a better slide that can help to really punch home this idea that we know. So when we talk about this idea here, this dotted line in terms of expected values, the expected number of deaths, this is in epidemiologists' minds a very solid number. Like this is not some loosey-goosey number like, oh, what's the expected number. From an epidemiologist point of view, this is something you bank on. This is something like, so if there's estimates of the number of people in the world who are over the age of 100, or the number of people in the United States over the age of 100, we know this within like a few people, plus or minus of people. Like you know exactly how many people there are. So when you're looking at the expected values here of the all-cause mortality, when you add up all people dying from cancer and heart disease and all the other diseases of the body, and as well as accidents and every other cause of death, the expected value at the population level is extremely tight. And so as a result, when we look at the total number of cases, the observed number of cases versus the expected number, then something extraordinary is going on. And so we can mathematically then identify what that difference is. And I don't know if it's very easy to see here based on this. I can maybe make one of these a little bit bigger. But basically you see two colors here. The gray represents the reported number of SARS-CoV-2 deaths. And then the tan are these additional deaths that are unreported. And so for instance, here what we're looking at is New York City in terms of their reported deaths. So what this means is that so here's the expected number during this time period. It looks like it might have been normalized, but basically this dotted line is the expected number of deaths during that time period. And so these are the difference with SARS-CoV-2. If this is not SARS-CoV-2, then that means there's a whole different outbreak of something that we're not even looking at, because this is also above the the expected value. So that means the number of deaths here, the thousands and thousands of deaths are caused by something. And so we know that this is the observed and this is the expected. And because they're caused by something and it's thousands more deaths than expected, then every reasonable epidemiologist, public health person, for every disease, when we're talking about HIV or flu, we use the exact same criteria. This is the criteria we use from an epidemiologist point of view. There's no controversy here. This is the number of total SARS-CoV-2 deaths. Some of them are reported and some of them are not reported. And so we can go through, there's been some interesting work looking at how this has varied from place to place. So this was New York City and New York State that I just showed you. Here what we're looking at is total US. And you can see that we've gotten better at reporting in some places, but whoops. I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger. All right, so you can see that we were getting better. We were getting better at reporting the deaths, and that was because the load of people dying was not nearly as bad, say during most of the month of June, and so we had a much better idea of who was dying from what. But now you can see there's just a little bit of a hint that at the end of May when this was reported, so this wasn't June rather, this was May, where we got it better under control. But then in June, you can see that there's a little bit of a hint where the number of unreported SARS-CoV-2 deaths is actually rising again as a percentage. And I suspect that now, so this study only did it from March to May. And so what I'm expecting is that we are going to be seeing over the next few weeks and couple of months that we're going to again see this big divergence between reported deaths and actual deaths. And so that's already starting to be witnessed in some places like Florida, some other places where the observed deaths are higher than the expected deaths and different than what's reported by SARS-CoV-2. But in terms of publications, there's not a lot now. I can maybe start looking at that in coming weeks. But this is definitely, there's politics behind it now. And so people don't want to report SARS-CoV-2 because if they don't report SARS-CoV-2 deaths, then it's as if it didn't happen for a lot of people. And so, and the reason is, I mean, so let's talk about this for just a couple more seconds. If someone has a heart attack and they also have SARS-CoV-2, do you put the cause of death as a heart attack or do you put it as SARS-CoV-2? Again, on the individual level, you don't know. I mean, it could be both that's causing it. It could be that they had a precondition and that they were going to have a heart attack that next day, no matter what, and then they happened to get SARS-CoV-2 as well and they died, but they would have died anyway from the heart attack. But on a population level, we know really, really strongly how many total people will have heart attacks or strokes or other diseases on a daily level. And I brought up myocardial infarction, so heart attack on purpose, because we know that SARS-CoV-2 is now at least as important a blood clotting disease as it is a lung disease or any of the other things that we found. And these blood clots are really important that we need to be paying attention to. And it significantly increases the risk of heart attack, stroke, embolism, and blood clotting. So it's something that we have to pay attention to. But I think a lot of people, when we're going to be looking at heart attacks, all-cause or heart attack mortality observed versus expected, I can bet you over the next couple of months, we're going to see a very big discrepancy between what's reported and what's actually expected versus what we're seeing. All right, Beck, I'll leave it there with that.
Yeah, great charts, Glenn. That really describes the situation so well. Thank you. So I think probably at least once a day, probably more, about that picture you've shown about that study that was done in the restaurant and how the air circulated and those who were sitting in the stream of the air circulation ended up getting sick and those who were not did not. But do we know anything more about how contagious this virus is and how it's spread? Inside, outside, is there anything new that you've uncovered that would be useful for us to know?
Yep, certainly. I'll talk about that. I think that was the Chinese restaurant study that we were referring to. I was trying to pull it up real quickly. I need to do a better job of organizing these slides so I can pull them up. There's just so many weeks of slides. There's hundreds of slides that I have at this point. But basically, so yeah, what we do know is that outdoor exposure is at significantly lower risk than indoor exposure, regardless of anything else, regardless of social distancing, regardless of wearing a mask. Simply being outdoors is healthier than being indoors. So if you're inviting someone over, just do it outside. Don't even invite anyone inside because the risk inside is significantly higher. One thing that we've seen, whoops, let me go back down here, is so there is a controversy right now about whether the virus can be aerosolized. And the difference between an aerosol and sort of a larger size droplet is that an aerosol is much, much smaller. And so an aerosol, for instance, might even be able to get out of the mask a lot faster and a lot easier. An aerosol can stay hanging in the air inside for longer periods of time, for maybe many minutes. It could circulate in the air. And especially if someone with SARS-CoV-2 who is asymptomatic currently, so they're pre-symptomatic but will eventually get symptoms, they could be spreading it simply by talking, and that could influence just it being in the air and people getting infected. When you're outdoors, because there's no ceiling and there's more wind and circulation generally, it makes it much easier for the air just to not be stagnant, to stay in the same place. So being outdoors is much safer. Still, for sure, socially distance yourself and wear the masks and all this other stuff, but outdoors is much better. In terms of the specific question that you're having, though, in terms of the controversy, let me come back here. This was, let me see. Oh yeah, so there's another thing that was about that I had prepared about this in terms of how contagious it is. So we found, so here's some studies. There are two things that we're thinking about when we're talking about how contagious this virus is. The first is how much viral shedding occurs. And viral shedding is the amount of RNA that can be found in these PCR, polymerase chain reaction tests, that is found in the environment or when someone sheds it from different places. It's been identified in a bunch of different ways. Right now, a lot of the tests that we're doing, the diagnostic tests, are nasal swabs, but some of them also use spit. There's other places where it's been found. Interestingly, so let me just say, in nasal swabs, around 63% of people who had the disease tested positive with the nasal swab, just in this test. It was a very small number of people. So in other studies, it seemed like it was higher. So I'm not paying too much attention to this. In sputum, it was a lot higher, 72%. But again, in other studies, it's been found to be higher. So again, I'm not paying too much attention. For me, what I found most interesting was this. Around 29% of people who were infected with SARS-CoV-2, 29% of them had it in their feces, which is astonishing. So before, we just thought that this was just viral shedding. We didn't think that people could get infected from it. And similarly, in blood, this was viral shedding, around 1%, so not as much, but still that's not nothing at the population level. 1% of SARS-CoV-2 patients, according to this study, have active virus in their blood that was identified just simply taking a blood sample. Now, again, viral shedding does not necessarily mean that the virus is viable, that it can replicate. So there have been some other studies that have gone on and evaluated. So for instance, in feces, the 29% of people who have viral shedding in their feces, how much of that is viable? And what they found is just a proof of concept that they said that live virus has been isolated from fecal samples. And so we still don't know at this point. I mean, it's disappointing that we're already beginning of July. We don't know how infectious it is. So we do know that viral shedding has been found. We do know that it has been identified as being infectious, but we don't know how long it's infectious for in feces or blood or other things, and we don't know the level of infectivity. And the reason this becomes important is because then it's almost in some ways a different type of disease. We've been talking about this as a respiratory disease, whereas when you talk about feces, then if people aren't 100% clean in terms of their hand washing and stuff, then potentially this is another route of exposure where people go to the bathroom and then they touch other people and they touch other surfaces, and this could be something that is a source of transmission. It is a lot smaller than the respiratory route that we're looking at so far, but it's something that I'm definitely paying attention to. Blood as well. Right now, we generally have very safe practices when it comes to blood, but it's something that we probably have to stay aware of. The other thing is we found that so typically when you look at infectivity, even though viral shedding goes on for maybe 2 months after people develop symptoms, what we found consistently is that the amount of viable virus goes down dramatically by around the 2nd week. So in the 3rd week, even if someone is shedding virus, they're very, very unlikely to be contagious. And so that's really good news. The unfortunate thing is that the viral shedding in feces was found to take place, with viable samples, was found to take place after the viable samples had no longer been found from the respiratory route. And so that's again why I'm thinking, still paying attention to this, because there could be ongoing infection in someone for multiple months. That's still unclear yet. We do know that some people have symptoms for multiple months. That could be just because it's an immune system thing rather than a viral thing, but we weren't sure what's going on. And there could still be viral replication and disease process going on in a person more than a month after a person got sick, even though they're not actively contagious 2 weeks after. It could be, and because it's not really a blood disease, we do know that it definitely affects the blood lining in terms of the clotting and other kinds of things. But because it's not really a typical blood disease that you would think about, it's more of like a local disease, local to the lungs, and then local to the gastrointestinal system, and local to whatever the epithelial cells are in these different parts of the body. Because that's what we're looking at, there could be parts of the body where the virus is still replicating and still causing disease, but we just don't know. So we are tracking that there's elevated liver enzymes in people that stay high for a while and things like this. So there is a good chance that there's still disease process going on after people are sent home. After they feel better, there could still be something going on inside that we're still not sure about, that we're still tracking. All right, that's it.
Really interesting. So, you've taught us that this virus is not just a pulmonary virus, and that certainly people develop different kinds of responses. Some have no response, no symptoms. Clotting is another symptom, of course. But I remember, many sessions ago, you suggested we all go out and purchase a pulse oximeter, which I did, and I have it hanging in a safe spot. And but it's interesting that somebody had asked, why do some people who are infected not feel out of breath, even though they see on their pulse oximeter that their oxygen levels are very low?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So let's get back to this pulse oximeter for a second. So remember, early on, one of the findings in New Jersey, New York City, the Northeast, when we got hit really hard, was that a lot of people, particularly people over the age of 65, they didn't have any symptoms. And so they didn't have, they weren't out of breath, they had no symptoms, and they didn't realize that there was disease that was going on. But when you had an oxygen, one of these pulse oximeters that tested the oxygen, then you could find in these patients that a lot of times their oxygen levels were very low. Say 70%, 60%, were really, really low, like something that they needed to be rushed to the hospital for. And what they found was that if we gave people pulse oximeters that they could identify that this was a problem before they even had symptoms, then they could go to the hospital that day or two earlier, and that would make a big difference in potentially saving their lives. And so that means anyone listening in Florida, other parts of the country that are now dealing with this, you should be testing yourself with a pulse oximeter probably once a day, particularly in these areas where there's a lot of endemic virus now, where there's a big outbreak in your area. You should be testing it once a day, because even if you have no symptoms, doesn't mean you don't have a disease that's growing inside of you. And so that will help you to see. If your blood oxygen level falls below 95%, then that would be a good reason to pick up the phone and call your doctor and get their advice on what to do next. But this is something that it's one of the best clinical tools that people have at home. A lot of people who have SARS-CoV-2 do not have fevers. And so you might not have a fever, you might not have anything else, but the pulse oximeter could save your life. So now going back to the specific question, why don't people feel like why aren't they out of breath? If their oxygen levels are so low, what's going on? And there's a bunch of things going on here, and most of it I don't really understand. But one thing in particular I wanted to bring your attention to that I found just so fascinating and might explain part of what's going on. So I don't know how many of you have heard of pulmonary surfactant. So basically, surfactant is just a very fancy name for soap. And basically, a soap is, you've all heard that there's water and oil, and water doesn't dissolve in oil, and oil doesn't dissolve in water. And so those two kinds of things are they're considered polar opposites. They're polarized polar opposites. And what soap does, the definition of soap is a soap is anything that binds to both the water and the oil, and then binds to both. Some soaps, there's a lot of soaps because the whole range in between the fat and the water, there's a whole range of possible soaps. So some soaps produce a lot of fat, and they bind a lot with the fat and just a tiny bit with the water, whereas some soaps are mostly water soluble, so they dissolve in the water, and then they bind with a little bit of the fat. And so this is for industrial purposes, for different techniques and for different uses of the soap. One type of soap is probably better than another. We know in our houses we have lots of different kinds of soap for different types of things that we're cleaning, and that's part of the reason is in terms of the soap whether it's binding more with the water or more with the fat. And this is good because then when you wash the soap with water, then when the soap binds with the fat, then it helps to rinse it away when you have all the water in there too. And so pulmonary surfactant, it stands for surface active agent, but it's essentially a soap. And so why do we have soap in our lungs? Well, there's a couple main reasons. The two main reasons I would say are, one, the soap, because it binds with the water and the fat, it makes it so that our lungs are more flexible, more like a balloon. So it can very easily expand and contract. And surfactant, so soap, is one of the main reasons why our lungs are so flexible. There's other reasons too, but it really makes our lungs very flexible and makes them work. The other major reason is that it makes it so gas can diffuse across the cells, across the alveoli. And so the soap that it produces makes it so oxygen can get across much easier. And so one of the interesting things, and there's other things that surfactant does, I'm just going to limit it to those two here. But so what I found most interesting, and I'm sure you're going to find this equally interesting, is that SARS-CoV-2, one of the things it does in its genome, and this is fascinating, because you don't see this very often. Let me bring this to the front. So when you look at the different components of the soap in our lungs, so this lung surfactant, when you look at the different components that are made by the human body to make the soap, our body actually makes the soap, and our body doesn't have these advanced industrial compounds to make soap. So what our body does is we can make proteins and we can make sugars and other types of things that we can formulate into using enzymes and using whatnot. And so we can create we have lots of different ways of creating components of soap. And so SARS-CoV-2, for some reason, has evolved its own genome to make soap. And what's really interesting is that it makes soap differently in some ways. There's a lot of overlap with the soap that people normally make, but it makes some additional kind of soap. We don't know why. We don't know why the virus is making soap. But so this lung surfactant, one of the key things it does is it makes oxygen easier to dissolve across the barrier. And so it could be that this could be one of the major reasons why, I don't know for sure, I don't know if anyone knows for sure yet, why the people can still breathe. It doesn't feel like they're out of breath when they're even though their oxygen levels are so low. This could be one of those reasons. But for me, it's just fascinating that the SARS-CoV-2 is generating soap in our lungs, and we don't know what else it's doing. But it's just fascinating because it's considered expensive when you have a genome. If you're a virus or a bacteria, to carry around all that RNA and DNA, that's expensive. If you, in the sense of it costs a lot more to reproduce, to travel. So an RNA that's really, really small and is potentially lighter can presumably be more contagious in some ways because it can spread quicker, it can replicate faster if there's less of it to replicate. Whereas if you have a huge RNA genome, then that costs more to make. It costs more to replicate, it costs more to spread. And so for this RNA virus to make soap, that something is going on that makes it beneficial for the virus. And this could be one of the things. If people are walking around without symptoms with this but are still contagious, then this could be what's driving it. The RNA soap that's being made by the virus. So I just think this is fascinating.
I agree. It is fascinating. I like the way you describe it, Glenn. I never would have thought in a million years that we have soap in our lungs. So very useful description. So we have a couple more questions that came in during the week that I'll pose to you, Glenn, just in a moment. But I wanted to remind everybody that if you have questions you'd like to ask, we soon will be opening it up for a Q&A. So just shoot me a note through the chat at the bottom, and I will put you in the queue if you have a question to ask. Okay, so Glenn, you've told us about the population on a whole. Any updates about children in particular and the risk of the disease in children? We've heard about Kawasaki's disease. Have you heard anything more about this?
Yeah, so yeah, this is a good time to bring this up. There's been a lot of research. As you can understand, people are very, very concerned about the potential of severe disease in children. So this has been investigated. Now we know that this is not a concern for most people. We knew before that it was rare, but now we know it's even more rare than we thought. So right now, the statistics are that for kids under the age of 21, so among people who have ever gotten SARS-CoV-2 and been laboratory confirmed, the risk of Kawasaki's disease is 2 out of every 100,000 people who have SARS-CoV-2. So among people who get infected with SARS-CoV-2, 2 out of every 100,000 people will get this Kawasaki's disease. It is extremely, extremely rare. So for most people, this is not something to be concerned about. And just as a comparison, the infection rate for SARS-CoV-2 in people under the age of 21 so far has been around 322 for every 100,000 people so far. Obviously, the infection is growing. This number is going to change in terms of the infection, but this number among people who are infected and get it is probably unlikely to change very much. So it's very rare. So far, the total number of people identified by these studies that we're looking for it, only 300 cases around the whole United States were identified. It's now not called Kawasaki's disease. That's what it was called earlier because it represented that some of the same symptoms. Now we're calling it multi-system inflammation syndrome, or MIS-C, or MISC. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced actually. But so this is the new name for it. But again, it's really rare. Only 300 cases identified in the US as of the time of the study, which was I think approximately early June or so. We'll say mid-June. But the study I think didn't cover that whole period. And no one under the age of 5, or only a few children under the age of 5 were identified, and that the average age was closer to 6 to 12 years old. But again, extremely rare. The average age was 8, extremely rare disease, so nothing to be worried about.
Thank you, Glenn. That's a really helpful update. Moving on to the different kinds of tests. So we talk a lot about the test for active virus, and now we have the antibody test. Can you explain how this antibody test works? How do biologists know what antibodies to look for? And could there be other antibodies for SARS-CoV-2 that we are not testing for?
Yeah, so this was a question from last week. So basically, there's different types of immunoglobulins in the body, and each type of immunoglobulin has its own binding with a potential antigen. So in this case, SARS-CoV-2, the antigen is what we're looking for the antibody to attach to. And that was such a good question. Last week I didn't know the answer off the top of my head. I went back and looked. There are a lot of possible antibodies that are generated for SARS-CoV-2. Some stick to the spike, some stick to other parts of the virus, and there's lots of different there's lots of different places where the antibody can be binding to. So I was looking at some of the studies, and it sounds like what they do generally is they're looking at antigens that are specific to the spike protein. So basically, these are the ones that are most likely to be these neutralizing antibodies because they're binding directly to the spike protein. And so they do seem to be the most common type of antibody that's produced. So people with this antibody are likely to have other antibodies that for SARS-CoV-2 for different parts of the virus. So it's a pretty good representation, but probably these antibody tests that we're looking at aren't looking at the complete picture. So there could be people out there with other antibodies that are not identified. But frankly, if someone has developed antibodies, but they don't have any for the spike protein itself, then it's probably not going to be an effective antibody response. And so it's probably not going to be sufficient to clear the virus. and they'll probably still have active virus during that period. So that's the short answer. The problem is when you're looking for a clinical test, you need something that's cheap and fast to do in order to have it that's something that's useful. Like here's an example. When we're looking at the viral shedding, you need a very fast test. And so that for that, we're looking at the RNA PCR test, the polymerase chain reaction test, where it could be very fast to look at viral shedding. It doesn't tell us about the viability of the virus, because in order to identify the viability of the virus, it requires actually culturing the RNA in petri dishes with cells that it can infect and then see what's infected. And that is extremely resource intensive. So we don't currently have a test on the market that we could commercially see if someone is producing our virus that's viable, that can infect other people. So that's why we have to use the more expensive procedures that we're using for studies, and then the tests that are commercially widely available are the easy things that we can do. And so that's why we don't have all the answers that we want. For the antibody tests that we're doing, it's another example where we don't look at the full universe of antibodies that have been generated for SARS-CoV-2. We pick the ones that we think are most likely to be representative and use those at the population level. We do know, but for a variety of reasons, that the antibodies load, that the amount of antibody we can find decreases over time in a bunch of people used in SARS-CoV-2, and that there is a threshold. And some people might still have antibody in their system that's just below the threshold for detection. And that's just a factor of any test that's developed. But you have to balance these things to be able to execute it on the population level for something that's both cheap and can get the job done sufficiently.
Well, clearly we can't stump you, Glenn.
Oh, you did last week. I just follow up.
No.
I like questions like this.
Came right back to us with a very involved answer. So kudos to this group for trying to stump you, and kudos to you for coming back with the answer. So with that, I will open it up now to the audience with questions. Our first questions, Sandy Ruck, I will ask you to unmute. There you are. If you could ask your question about what's happening internationally.
Oh, there you are, Glenn. Glenn, in terms of testing, I'd like to think I'm not paranoid, but I am suspect coming from Florida and having our numbers, requested by our governor to be altered or falsified, and a separate dashboard is being made. How accurate are statistics from other countries? Because we have no control over that. We barely have it in the United States.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think it varies dramatically by country. So for instance, here's tests. There are, right now, so there's two ways in which it could vary. One way is just that there's insufficient testing, and that's deliberate because they don't want to know what they don't want to know. And so that could be one thing. And then the other thing is that they're specifically lying. And both of those things could be true. I think that there's a lot of motivation in a lot of countries to really help the population, and they want to identify all the cases because they then a lot of countries are doing really well right now. Like, so for instance, when you look at a lot of countries, I mean, some of these are smaller ones. Look at Estonia. They would have no reason to lie. They're doing so well. They want everyone to know exactly how well they're doing. They only had one case yesterday. And so this is great. So from Estonia's point of view, the more people who know how great they're doing, the better. So I have high confidence in Estonia right now. A lot of other, so when you look at Finland and when you look at Hungary and Iceland, you see that there's a lot of countries that have really done an extraordinarily great job of getting it under control. They had the first wave, they got it under control, and they're doing pretty well now. Some have struggled a little bit, but when you look at some of the bigger countries like Germany, Italy, Netherlands, South Korea, you see that there was this first wave and they mostly got it under control. The only way to get it under control is if they're actually testing sufficiently and being able to trace it. So this is a lot of countries, I think, are reporting accurately. The ones that are not, I think, are probably aligned with the countries in terms of the ones who are doing poorly. Places where we have insufficient tests or where things are bad, I don't trust it as much. Chile, I just don't trust what's going on there right now. Maybe there's been a more severe lockdown in early in June that I'm not aware of. I can check on that for next week, but I don't think that that's the case.
It just showed Ethiopia, and Ethiopia went straight up, and now it's straight down. So I
Yeah.
just think that some of these countries, I think it's probably has a lot to do with what the government is like and what the whole country, how it's run, rather than just the World Health Organization.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's it's a question of is the country is the leadership of the country working for the population to help them stay healthy and strong, or do they want to not do that? And there's a lot of countries that are just not prioritizing the health and safety and well-being of their citizenry, and that's what you get. Right now, we don't know so this idea that I was talking about earlier in terms of all-cause mortality versus so sort of like the excess mortality versus the observed versus expected. This you can see in all countries around the world. We have better data in some countries than others, and it's hard to do in real time, but within the next year or two, we're going to have a really good sense of which countries were lying versus not in terms of how many people died over the course of the year. Because if you see many thousands of people more dying this year versus last year for unexplained reasons, you know that SARS-CoV-2 was likely to be the explanation for what's going on.
Great question, Sandy Rock. And Glenn, thank you for taking us around the world like that. Very, very helpful. Do we have any other questions? Does anyone else in the audience have a question? You can unmute yourself or raise your hands. Okay, so maybe
Great.
we'll jump into, we haven't yet talked about, well, I think last week we talked about the social unrest and the ramifications of the rioting and what the results that we would ultimately see. Do you feel that the spike that we're seeing can be attributed to the social unrest that we've been experiencing around the country?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there's a study. I think this is a preprint that we're looking at. I did not put I apologize, I didn't put the link here. So let me, next week I'll tell you what the link is. But for now, there are some really interesting studies looking, oh, there's the link on the bottom. I can't see it on my screen. There it is, the link on the bottom. I always like to have the source on the bottom in case people are interested and they can go and read it themselves. But so here's the first interesting picture is the blue, I think the blue is places where there were reports of violence. And the yellow represents places where there were protests that were peaceful. And so this is just one thing that the study evaluated to see if violence versus peaceful protest had more interactions in terms of potential spread. Because one of the things that we know is potentially if there was more violence, then there might have been more tear gas and other things, which would have made people take off their masks and other things. And so that was one thing that was looked at. But then more importantly, when you compare cities, so here red cities are cities that had protests, and then black cities here are ones that did not have protests, but were of roughly the same size. And so you can compare the spread in cities that had protests versus the ones of roughly the same size and see, was there a difference in the spread of SARS-CoV-2? And similarly, you can see the counties in which the SARS-CoV-2, not SARS-CoV-2, you can see the counties in which the Black Lives Matter protests occurred, and you can compare these counties to other counties to see if there were similar rates of infection. Wow, a lot of words. All right, so here's what they found. So they found two really interesting things here. The first thing that they found is that it seems like the protests encouraged more people to stay at home, rather than more people going out. So because everyone knew that the protests were going on, people during the time of the protest, the 1 or 2 days around the protest, a lot of these protests lasted for multiple days, they actually stayed home more, and so they avoided these public areas. And so what we found is, so the week or so before had higher amount of social movement. Then during the time period of the protest, those areas where the protests occurred actually had fewer social movements in terms of the people moving around, so fewer people moving around. And then after the protests were over, there was more movement. So in some ways, you would expect, just based on this alone, that there would be less spread of the virus simply because people weren't, and the overall population weren't moving around. But one thing that we found, so regardless, both in terms of the overall behavior at the county level versus the protests themselves, is that when we're looking at the total amount of COVID-19 case growth over time, what you find is that there was actually a decrease in the places that had the protest. So these protests, and because of you, when you're looking on most of these TV situations, first of all, the two most important things that we saw are, one, they were outdoor protests. They weren't inside, they were outdoor. And two, the vast majority of people were wearing masks. And so those two things alone explain most of what we're seeing here in terms of this. Even if social distancing wasn't at 100%, those two things made a huge difference. Obviously, social distancing is so important. The other thing that was suspected of going on here was people were moving around. And so if someone had SARS-CoV-2 and attended the protest, they were not sticking right next to the same person for hours at a time. Instead, because people were walking around, they might have just spent a few seconds walking past someone. And so one of the things that we've seen earlier is that the longer the length of time that that you have an infected person talking with an uninfected person, the greater the risk of getting infected. So just being around someone for a few seconds in passing probably is a really, really low risk. And then when you put the mask on top and it's outside and all this other stuff, that probably explains what we're seeing here. So right now, the best evidence is that there was no increased risk from the Black Lives Matter protest.
Were you surprised to see this result? Because this feels incredibly counterintuitive. Now I understand based on your description. Were you as surprised as I am to see this?
I was cautiously optimistic. And I was worried. I was worried. One thing that we know is that the people going out to the protests tended to be at lower risk. They tended to be younger people and people at lower risk. Black minorities, other racial minorities tend to be at higher risk. And so I was worried specifically for some of these demographics that there might be increased risk, both of infection and of severity of disease if they were infected. But so I was pleasantly surprised and definitely relieved to see these results. I wasn't thinking it was going to be super bad, but these results definitely are great to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So unless we have any other questions from the audience, does anybody have anything else they'd like to add or ask? Glenn, you did it again. You brought us up to speed. I think I can speak for everyone when I say I feel so well equipped to take on the week after meeting with you and you breaking down the news for us. And I know we often like to leave with some good news. Do you have any other dog stories to share?
I don't have a dog story. I can talk about the Neanderthal question.
Yes.
Do you want me to talk about that? I don't know that it's good news. It's just really interesting. So I can just, here, let me share my screen again. I'll just spend a couple minutes on that then. So as part of that, here, give me 1 second to find where I just put it. So previously, in fact, I should have brought this up earlier. So previously, you might have remembered that we talked about blood type and the risk of getting COVID-19. And so there have been some additional studies, and now it's not as clear cut as it seems. There's a new study where if you recall previously, I think it was on slide 298. So let me just jump back and forth real quickly. So this was what we talked about with blood type last, either a week ago or 2 weeks ago, where we found 2 signals in the genome that were associated, pardon me, with severe COVID-19. One was this spot over here on chromosome 3, and one was ABO. This is the different blood types that seemed like it could possibly be related. Seemed like it was right that there might be a signal, but it might have just been noise because it was not. You see the red dashed line that this was a much stronger signal. Well, it looks now on reflection. So let me just jump back to where I just was. It looks back on reflection that signal has gone away when we looked at a different population of people, a different meta-analysis. And so now blood type is probably a little less likely. There might still be, so we'll see what future research predicts, but it might be that blood type is no longer related. But what has been confirmed is this chromosome 3. And so there were some people who were doing research on Neanderthals. And I think there was lots of Neanderthals living around 50,000 years ago. And so specifically in Croatian Neanderthals, they found that this gene was very common in them, or not just this gene, but sets of genes in this chromosome were very common in Neanderthals. And so people have gone back and looked at this. Are some people, do they have more copies of this gene than other types of people, or sets of genes? And what we found within this study that was reported is that these genes that were found in Neanderthals are somewhat common in South Asia. Around 8% of Europeans have this gene. Very, very few, I think less than 1% of people in Africa have this disease. Around in the United States, it's around 4%. But it's astonishing what's going on in South Asia. And does that mean that now we should worry that people from South Asian descent are at higher risk of COVID-19? And so I went back and just looked at this real quickly. First of all, this is just fascinating that just how genes have just migrated over tens of thousands of years. There was a study in England or UK that was recently published, and one of the things that it looked at, was in UK, they look at generally a bunch of different ethnicities and races. In the United States, unfortunately, we have a very myopic view, and we tend to look at whites, blacks, and Latinos, and that's it. And we don't look at the much broader variation in ethnicities and races. But so sometimes we have to look outside of the country and other places to see what this might look like. In UK, they found that people of South Asian descent had a 20% more likely chance of having severe illness. I think it looks like survival. So this was mortality they were looking at. So there seems like there is a little bit of a signal there. So this is something that we're going to have to keep tracking of. Not huge, but it's material. It's something that we're going to have to track. Interestingly, also, so one other thing that what they found was the country that had the highest percentage in the whole world was Bangladesh, and approximately 63% of people living in Bangladesh have at least one copy of this Neanderthal risk variant. And so I immediately went back. Let me stop sharing for a second. And when I saw this, I immediately went to my dashboard to see, well, what's going on? Is Bangladesh something that I hadn't thought about before? So, I mean, when we're looking over here, the risk for Bangladesh is, Bangladesh isn't doing very well, but a lot of countries aren't doing very well. I mean, in terms of their uptake curve. I don't know what's going on at this peak over here. I suspect it's just a lack of testing. But right now, let me show you the Data Explorer. So what I looked at this was confirmed cases. So Bangladesh, it's doing a little bit worse than India, but we're not looking anywhere near the rates that we're looking at in South America and the United States and some other countries. And so even if there is a slightly increased risk due to that set of genes, it doesn't seem like it's super important relative to some of the other risk factors that we've talked about. So it's just, for me, it's just fascinating that this Neanderthal. So previously we knew that tens of thousands of years ago, there was exchange of genetic information between Neanderthals and human beings or Homo sapiens. I guess these are all different kinds of humans. And so which I don't know. This is not my area, so I might be a little bit off here. But for me, the most fascinating thing is that genes, if they stay in the genome for long periods of time, typically there's some benefit that it's giving you. And so it's interesting. We don't know what's the potential benefit coming from these things that we haven't seen. But it could also cause harm. And in this case, we're seeing that there potentially is something that we need to be worried about with SARS-CoV-2. But with something to keep an eye on. We're not sure yet.
Glenn, I've known you a really long time. In fact, I've known you my whole life. And you never cease to amaze me with your vast knowledge and the way that you just compared Neanderthals to Homo sapiens. I mean, you totally showed up to your classes. Must be very proud.
I am proud.
Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us today. And this was so helpful as always, Glenn. And thank you those who are watching after on YouTube. And as always, Glenn, can we expect to meet you same time, same place next week, Sunday at 7?
Great. Send me questions if you have questions, and I'll try to answer them during the week.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Be
Everyone.
safe, be well. See you next Sunday.
All right, sounds good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.